Good afternoon, and welcome to the penultimate research exchange. One more this year. I'm Carl Blumstein. I'm the director of the CITRIS I4 Energy Center, which is one of the 4 initiatives from CITRIS. And is something of the sponsor of this particular seminar. A welcome for web viewers from around the system. Today we were expecting to hear from Mike Isaacson at UC Santa Cruz. Mike had a family emergency and is unavailable, and Catherine Wolfram generously stepped in. I will finish my introduction about Catherine in just a moment, but first a couple of announcements. Next week is the final research exchange, and Marina Gorbis, the executive director of the Institute for the Future, will be speaking. And finally, please compost everything with your lunch today except the foil. Don't put the foil in the compost. Mm-hmm. So Catherine's title is before you. She is the Cora Jane Flood Professor of Business Administration at the Haas School of Business, and the co-director of the Energy Institute at Haas. She has studied the impact of environmental regulation on energy markets and the effects of electricity industry privatization and restructuring around the world. She received a PhD in economics from MIT. Before joining the faculty at UC Berkeley, she was an assistant professor of economics at Harvard. Catherine?
Great. Thanks, Carl, and thanks for all of you for coming. For those of you who are coming expecting to hear about microgrids, I will talk about microgrids at the very end of this talk. So not the talk that you might have shown up for, but hopefully one that you'll be interested in as well. I wanted to talk about some ongoing research that I have looking at electrification in rural Kenya and rural India. And before I start, I just wanted to mention that this is a part of a broader project, and there are many people involved in the project. So just to kind of nod to the people who are contributing to this, it's joint work with Professor Ted Miguel, who's an economist and works a lot in Kenya. He's a development economist. And Professor Eric Brewer, who's many of you probably know, in the Electrical Engineering and Computer Science Department here. Also Meredith Fowley, who's a colleague of mine. She's an economist in the Agriculture and Resource Economics Department. So plus a bunch of graduate students and researchers in Kenya and India. But I'll tell you about what we're doing in these projects. Just to motivate the topic, I wanted to start with a picture. And maybe some of you have seen this. I first saw this series of pictures presented by Arun Majumdar, but I love the way that this kind of motivates an interest in energy use in the developing world. So I'm an empirical economist, and I like to think of different ways of displaying data. So to me, this is a really good way of displaying how electricity is used around the world. It's a picture of the world at night. And I think it's a pretty good way to summarize, where people are using electricity and where they're not. So for instance, you can start by looking at California, and you can see the Bay Area, you can see the LA area, so you can kind of see where the density of the population is, where people live. And there's Portland, Seattle, that's probably Salt Lake City. Oh yeah, there's the east, you can see how the eastern seaboard is lit up, how Florida looks pretty lit up. You can see how more people live in the plains states than live in the Rocky Mountain states. West of the Rockies, it's a little less light than it is east of the Rockies. And then you can see, okay, there's Europe, India, there's the rest of the world. This is kind of the, like the old New Yorker cartoon. This is the California energy economist view of the world. Focus hard on California, and then there's the rest of the world. So when you look at this, you might think that the lights show you where people live, but this is a map of where people actually live. So this is just population density per square kilometer, and you can see that there's just broad parts of northern India, for instance, much of China, where the population is very dense. You can even look at sub-Saharan Africa and notice that it's about as dense in population terms as the whole of the eastern United States. Okay, so then superimpose the lights on the people, and you see that there are a large number of people, for instance, in northern India, in the more the lower income provinces there, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, where there are a lot of people, but very little electricity use. If you accept this kind of the world at night as a summary for electricity use. You can see Indonesia, you can see much of China. Another statistic to make this point, all of sub-Saharan Africa uses as much electricity as New York City. So just very different representations, very different kind of indications of energy use per capita, summarized here. So what I'm trying to do with these research projects that I'm going to summarize and with my broader research agenda is really try to understand how this map is likely to change going forward. What will happen as much of sub-Saharan Africa, India, China, as people get access to electricity, and not only electricity, but other forms of commercial energy. So by vehicles, natural gas, etc. So another way to make the point, this is kind of the boring economist way to summarize this point, is to look at projections of where the growth in energy use is likely to come. So this is a plot to the left of 2010. Those are actual numbers. To the right with the dots, those are projections. And this is not just electricity this time, but total energy consumption. So quadrillion BTU. We're converting oil, natural gas, electricity all to the same metric. And so you see here, for one thing, that the developing world, in red, those are the non-OECD countries, have passed the developed world recently in terms of energy use. And all of the projected growth is expected to come from the developing world. This is something like 84% growth, and this is 14% growth. So as an energy economist, I look at that and I think I really need to understand what's going on in the developing world in order to understand energy markets. If you think about this from a CO2 perspective, it's even more dramatic, the difference between the red and the blue. Because in general, the CO2 intensity of energy production in the red countries in the developing world is higher. The CO2 intensity is higher. And so the difference is even more stark if you think about it in terms of CO2 intensity. So to those of you who are graduate students and are thinking about areas to explore, I highly recommend energy use in the developing world. There are just many unanswered basic questions. And I'll show some of these to you, just basic data that you can collect that informs this. I think there are a lot of things to do around these topics, and I hope that you'll consider getting into them. Okay, so what I want to do today is describe two ongoing projects that we have that are looking at energy use amongst people in the developing world who are recently getting access to electricity and how this changes their lives. I'm going to be focusing on two studies. I'll probably spend the most time talking about the study in Kenya, and I'll spend a little time at the end talking about the study in India. India is where we're doing microgrids. We're thinking about grid extensions, so that the extensions of the national grid in Kenya. So the two projects have a lot in common. The technology for delivering the electricity is different. Microgrids on the one hand, the national grid on the other hand. But we have a lot of kind of similar questions. So for one thing, we're trying to think about, how is that map likely to change with the people who don't have access to electricity now? What are the main barriers to getting people electricity? Are they financial? Are they technological? What could we do to try to alleviate those barriers? I also want to think about, I think we all assume that access to electricity is a good thing, but there are many things that governments and societies can spend money on. You can think about access to health care, access to clean water, So we want to think about access to electricity and really compare it to these other infrastructure or other investments. And to do that, we want to think exactly, kind of precisely, how does access to electricity transform a household's well-being or transform people's well-being? Do kids study longer at night? Do incomes go up? Does health improve because you have refrigeration? So we want to try to kind of precisely measure the impact that access to electricity has on a household's well-being. And I mean, I think since I've mentioned GHGs, it's clear that there's this tension here, but we do want to think about, creating these development benefits while at the same time minimizing the environmental impacts of increased electrification. So we want to think about if we give people access to electricity, what does that replace? Is that replacing kerosene? Or is it not replacing kerosene? Maybe when you give people access to electricity in their home, they keep the kerosene lamp. So we want to understand the trade-offs and understand what's happening as electrification increases. Okay, so in terms of barriers to electricity use in Kenya, I think this graph speaks a lot to what the barriers are. So the blue line here plots the share of the population that has electricity in their house. Right now it's very low, 16%. And that's countrywide, so even lower in rural areas. The red line plots the share of the population that's within 1 kilometer of the distribution system, basically 1 kilometer of a transformer. And so you see that in 2012, if you extend that out, make that 18% or something, you see that there's this big share of the country that's literally living under the grid. So there's something like 73% of the people who are near a connection, but only say 18% of them are actually connected, actually have electricity in their house. And I'll show you some maps in a second that make this concrete. But that's to me that suggests that there's something else besides technology going on there. That the grid is very close to people, but for some reason they're not getting connected. One factor, and we think this explains a lot of it, is that to get connected to the electricity grid, you have to pay $400. And the average national income in Kenya is $800. So, think of that in U.S. terms. Here, the average income is, say $50,000 a year. That's like charging people $25,000 to connect to the electricity grid. It's just basically prohibitive for a large share of the households. So one thing we want to do is think about as you lower the price of the connection, or perhaps as you think about financing the connection. $400 is a lot of money up front, but you'll have the electricity connection for a long time, so you could maybe finance that over a 10-year period. How does that change connectivity? Can we try to reduce some of that gap between the blue line and the red line? Okay, so just one more point, and I wanted to put this up because this is a picture I took. This is in the kind of receiving yard of the Rural Electrification Agency. So one of the reasons for this big increase in the share of the population that's near the grid is that the Rural Electrification Agency in Kenya has had this massive program to try to connect secondary, and now they're moving to primary schools. And so they've really been really ambitious about extending the grid to lots of areas in the country, but just not connecting actual households. So this, they're continuing to do this. This is a picture of a bunch of transformers kind of waiting to be installed in the Rural Electrification Agency's kind of clearinghouse in Western Kenya. Okay, so what we want to study, as I said, is what's the consumer demand for electrification? As you lower the price from $400, say down to $200 or $50 or $10, how does that change the share of households willing to connect to the grid? And related to that, we want to think about what's the socioeconomic benefit of getting a household connected. How does the household change their lives? How do the way people spend time, how do those things change when you get the household connected? Okay, so just to summarize the first question, we really don't know. If you think of this as the price of the electricity connection represented as a percent of the existing cost. The existing cost is what I said was $400. So if instead it's $200 or $40, how many more people will connect to the grid? And we don't know whether the demand curve looks like that, or looks like the red line. We don't know as we lower the price how many more people will get connected. I suspect, although I don't know, that you have to lower the price pretty dramatically, that it looks more like the blue line than the red line to get connections. But that's really what we're trying to figure out with our research. What we're going to do, and I'll explain exactly how we do this in a second, is we're going to implement a randomized control trial. So we're going to randomly vary the subsidy level that we're offering to households, although we're going to randomize kind of more at the community level so that we don't have neighbors getting very different offers of what the subsidy level is. And the advantage of the randomized control trial is that we're picking from an overall population and then picking randomly the ones that get the low subsidies versus the ones that get the high subsidies. And basically, if we've done the randomization correctly, the households are identical except for the fact that they've gotten higher or lower subsidies. And so then we can measure the take-up compared to, kind of baseline take-up. There might be general adoption of electrification. So even with the people who don't get any subsidy at all, we might see some take-up. But then we can compare that to the people who are randomly selected to get, say, a $40 connection cost and see how much that improves the take-up. And then we can compare the socioeconomic outcomes of those two households, the ones that were given the very cheap connection and the ones that were, and some of them will give them a free connection, and the ones that still had to pay $400. Okay, so let me explain exactly how the randomization is going to work. Right now, we have a team of people working in Western Kenya, and they're out mapping the transformers. So right now, the pins here indicate transformers that we've identified that are relatively new. We don't want the brand new transformers because then, we want to let people make their own decisions for, say, a year or two about whether to connect, and then we'll come in and offer the subsidies. So these are transformers that have been installed within, say, the past 5 years, but not super recently. And what we're doing now is going to each of these transformers and trying to figure out, who lives near the transformer. We want to connect people who are within 600 meters of the transformer because the $400 cost applies to anyone who's within 600 meters of the transformer. You have to be within, I think the Kenya Power and Lighting Company has determined that if it's further than 600 meters, it might cost them more to connect you. So this is an indication. So if you look at this white dot, that's one of those red pins on the map that I just showed you. That's the transformer. And then this is representative. I'm going to show you a bunch of these maps, so let me just show you what's going on here. The green circles are unelectrified households. The yellow diamonds are electrified households, compounds in this case. So you can see, and this is not unrepresentative, you can see that within the connection radius of the transformer, something like 4 out of 100 plus compounds are actually connected. And you can see that it's not necessarily related to how close you are. This guy's far away, and he's connected. And these guys, they're not the closest households. But I think it suggests to me that there are literally hundreds of households around here that are living under the grid. The distribution line is going out to this guy, probably crossing those people's property. The purple, so with households, we have them differentiated both by color and by shape if they're not connected. For the purple and the blue, the purple are the shops, the businesses, and the blue are the school buildings. There we don't differentiate by color, we just differentiate by shape. So the circles in this case are unconnected businesses, and the diamonds are the connected businesses. But let's focus on the households. Okay, so here's another map, and again you see that again you've got tons and tons of green dots, not very many yellow squares. So one thing that we intend to do going forward is kind of assemble this data, and figure out, to the extent we can, what it is that's determining whether or not a household is connected. We can measure kind of very roughly the household's income level. We can measure the distance to the transformer. And I think just documenting the fact that there is this extensive public infrastructure with the distribution network, but very few people actually connected, I think that will be a useful thing. So this is, we intended to do this just as kind of a preliminary step in our final study, in the randomization study. We needed to determine which households were there so we could figure out which ones to offer subsidies to. But even that preliminary step is yielding some interesting conclusions. Just these maps, I think, are interesting. Okay, so I'll show you more of them. I love Google Earth, too. Google Earth is an extremely powerful tool, and you can see how, it lets you see that this is a relatively steep area where there aren't many compounds, and so it makes sense that there are no dots over there. But again, on this case, you have a transformer. You've got some connected businesses, but very few people with actual connections. All right, here, it's a dense kind of market area with all the purple there. Okay, so just to give you a couple of these. Here's a final one. Another thing that we can do with Google Earth is use these as a way to evaluate how well the surveyors are doing, identifying whether or not households are connected. So this is kind of a preliminary step, a preliminary take on this transformer. Obviously, the surveyor missed this quadrant. We have to send somebody back to the area to remap it. Okay, so as I said, we're going to randomly select randomly select transformers. Imagine that the blue transformers are the treated transformers. Those are transformers where we will pick households to get a subsidy to the connection. And within the blue transformers, we'll randomize which ones get a low subsidy and which ones get a high subsidy. And then the red transformers, that's where we'll just kind of let whatever economic and socioeconomic factors play out, and we'll watch what happens to people's income levels, people's health, and then compare them between the blue transformers and the red transformers. So, this is a very interdisciplinary project. One indication of it is we're working with engineers who are helping us use these handheld Android devices to collect data. And I don't need to spend too much time getting into this, but this really improves the quality of the data that we can collect. It minimizes losses. We're not translating the data from paper surveys and then having it retyped in. So this is an example of the interdisciplinary nature of the project. Okay, so thinking about this second component of the research question, what are the socioeconomic impacts of electrification? This is a schematic that will explain what's happening with the randomization process. So we've got as I showed you, we've got those maps of all of the existing transformers in western Kenya. And then we're going to randomly divide them into treatment group and control group. Just to remind you, the treatment group is where the households are getting subsidies. The control group, we're kind of keeping them around to figure out what the underlying trends, socioeconomic trends are. And then we will give the treatment groups these subsidized electricity connections and then go back to them, say 12 months after they've gotten the electricity connection and measure economic and other kind of health-related outcomes. And so the idea is that if the green circle indicates households that have had an improvement in the socio and economic outcomes, we expect that we'll see more of them in the treated groups than in the control group. But we want to precisely measure them. We don't want to attribute all of the changes, all of the improvements in socioeconomic outcomes to the electrification. There's some just kind of general economic growth that's happening. But because we've done this randomization, we can precisely attribute any difference between the treatment group and the control group to the electrification. And as I've said, that's useful because we can then make kind of informed decisions about allocating resources. We can compare the socioeconomic benefits of electrification to clean water, for instance, or other infrastructure investments. Okay, we have some ongoing, that's basically ongoing right now. We are about, after January 2014, we will be going to these households and offering them the subsidies. We hope to have the connections established coming into the summer of 2014. There's much, much more to do here. So let me just give you a quick rundown of the types of things that we hope to do going forward. One is to measure variations in the reliability of the grid. I think, we've all heard stories about poor quality electricity in the developing world, but one thing that we found actually doing research here is that it's really hard to measure. There are really no good measures of the power quality. So one thing that the engineers that we're working with are doing is trying to develop an app to put on Android phones that will help measure outages and basically kind of crowdsource the measurement of the power quality. I'd be happy to talk to you more about this, but to me it's an indication of the wide openness of this field, that there are lots of unanswered questions. Even how unreliable is the grid and how does it vary kind of community to community. So I think we need to take a first step to get there by developing this measurement device. Another thing that we are thinking about doing is once we've got these connected households in the randomly selected transformer locations, we could increase the reliability of some of those transformer areas. We could think about giving individual households batteries, basically, and figuring out how getting access to reliable power might change your socioeconomic outcomes differently than getting access to unreliable power. So that's another variation that we could think about studying. We've been talking to other organizations who are interested in introducing financing schemes. We're going to just purely subsidize the connection, but you could think about not subsidizing it, but offering to finance the $400 connection cost over with different loan terms. Okay, so I said I would get to microgrids in the remaining kind of 3 minutes I have. Let me talk briefly about the ongoing research that we have in India that's around microgrids. I should also say that we started going to Kenya thinking that we were going to do a microgrid project. We were paired with a startup there who was interested in installing microgrids. But as we walked around the country, as we noticed, just the extent to which the grid had rolled out, it seemed like it was hard to justify a microgrid investment, given that the grid was coming so close to so many villages, given that the possibility of connecting to the national grid was so real for so many villages. In India, we're working on microgrids, and I think there are different challenges to connectivity in India than in Kenya. One is that the subsidies to the electricity sector, both direct subsidies and kind of implicit subsidies, because there's so much theft on the system, are just huge. And so there are not as many kind of financial incentives for the distribution companies there to expand the existing national grid. So here we're working with a microgrid developer who's got who has agreed with our research project to identify something like 80 villages that he would consider adding the microgrid to. And then we're going to randomly select 40 of those villages to actually install the microgrid. Again, keeping aside a treatment group of villages to monitor the socioeconomic outcomes of electrification. In this case, microgrid electrification compared to national grid electrification. Okay, so I think I'd be happy to take questions. I'd be happy to hear people's input here. Just to summarize, this is a slide that we showed as we were pitching this project to the Rural Electrification Agency in Kenya, trying to get their buy-in to the study. They basically have to agree to hold the connection cost at $400 and not make it any higher. We showed this slide without their logo, and they said, we want our logo up on that slide. So it was a successful venture in to talk to the Rural Electrification Agency, but suffice it to say that this is a multi-agency, kind of multi-partner project funded in a large part by USAID. I'd be happy to take questions or comments.
Let me, before we start questions, let me ask people to wait till you get a microphone before you ask your question, because that'll make it possible for people viewing from outside to do that. And to tell you that although Catherine has very graciously agreed to step in, she does have to leave a little early.
Yeah.
So we're going to have a hard end at 10 minutes to 1.
So first, I think we should thank our speaker. Do you have any experience with the actual sort of transfer of money on an ongoing basis? Does prepaid work? Is it preferable? Do you bundle it with cell phone sort of credits? Or what is your experience in the ground on how people should pay their electricity bills?
Yeah, so I didn't have time to talk about that, but one of the innovations that the entrepreneur who we're working with in India has is that they're prepay meters. That you pay ahead for the electricity connection. We're not going to, in this iteration of the study, we're not going to compare prepay to postpay in kind of a rigorous experimental setting, but I think that is one of the ongoing questions. How does the actual payment system matter? One fact or anecdote that I have on that is I've talked about financing the connection cost in Kenya, and they actually tried that. The Kenya Power and Lighting Company tried having loans. They were 10-year loans, very, very generous interest rates. But one thing that they didn't do was connect the loan repayment to your electricity usage. And so they had no way to cut people off who weren't paying their loans back. And basically the program bankrupted itself. It couldn't guarantee repayments without the connection between usage and repayment. So to me that suggests that prepay has some advantages. Directly tying payment of your either your per kilowatt hour usage or your connection cost to usage seems valuable.
Yeah, hi. So you mentioned, at one point you mentioned reliability. Do you get any sense for the trade-off between capacity and reliability? Like, would someone rather have 3 amps all the time or 20 amps some of the time?
So that's a great question. It's a wide open question. The only things that I do know is what you tend to see people doing first when they get connections are lighting and cell phone charging and TVs. So to me, those things are not as dependent on reliability as something like a refrigerator is. But again, that's what we would like to do, varying the reliability, is see how that changes usage, see how that changes the benefits that people get out of electrification.
So I was just wondering, kind of what is the usage landscape? How much power do people use? How much do they need? I mean, kind of what's the appliance like? What kind of appliances do people typically have?
Yeah, so I know anecdotally, just from baseline surveys that we've done in Kenya and from talking to the entrepreneur in India, and they don't use that much power. So that's one business model challenge that the entrepreneur in India faces is incenting people to do more than just use lighting and cell phone charging, because you can't recoup the cost of the solar microgrid that fast with just cell phone charging.
I'm just trying to get some numbers here to understand. And do you know what's the average ratio of the connected household within that circle, the average ones? And also, after your experiment, how much they increased? And how long is the time period people actually respond to your experiment?
So I showed you the maps, and we're literally today out there making more and more of those maps. We hope to have 200 maps, and then we'll summarize the data. So I don't know. I can eyeball them as well as you can, and I would guess that it's about 5%. That it's very low. Actually, one more thought on the usage. One thing that the entrepreneur in India is considering is incentivizing productive loads, so like milk chillers or agricultural pumping or something, just to kind of spread out to, if you've got the capacity of the system there, he wants to optimize the usage of the system, and thinks that adding some kind of productive load at the village level will help with that.
In the developed world, a lot of the energy use is for lighting. And as they deploy in the third world, I imagine or developing world, I assume they'll use sort of low energy lighting. And I wonder if the data is normalized to reflect that maybe their energy use overall might be proportionally lower over time because a lower proportion of their energy use is going towards the lighting. Does that make sense?
So I guess I expect that as development takes place, that people will move from lighting to refrigeration, air conditioning, either fans or air conditioners. So I guess one other thing on the India project that I didn't mention was that so there's this trade-off. So you might think that if they're doing primarily lighting, let's give them highly efficient lights. Let's give them LEDs instead of CFLs. Right now, the entrepreneur in India who we're working with gives every connected household 2 CFLs. One thing that we would like to do is give them 2 LEDs instead of 2 CFLs. But as an economist, and there are other people who have thought about this, you worry about what's called the rebound effect. That if you give people something that's more efficient, if you give them an LED instead of a CFL, it uses 50% as much electricity, but if you're paying per kilowatt hour, you can effectively get a lumen, a unit of lighting, for half as much money. And so as an economist, you think you're getting something for less money, you'll use it more. And so we'd like to measure that, the extent to which you see rebound. If you give people LEDs instead of CFLs, does it save, just the difference? Do you get 50% as much energy used? Or do you get a slightly lower difference in energy usage because the people with the LEDs end up using them more? Which is, you don't get as much energy efficiency as you expected, but you get more lighting. So you get more benefit from the usage of the light bulb.
So you said it was $400 for a connection.
Yep.
You can build a 1/4 kilowatt system for $400 that could store the energy and probably utilize, I'd say, about 80% of their needs. The big thing, cooling you can't do. That's too energy intensive. But refrigeration, lighting, powering your cell phone, it's just a thought.
Okay.
I'm just thinking.
But I would take the $400 with a grain of salt. That's what the Kenya Power and Lighting has calculated as their average connection cost. But they're only connecting, 5 out of 100 households. My guess is that if they were connecting every household within 600 meters of a transformer, it would be much, much lower than $400. So I think, the cost is endogenous to how many people are connecting.
Oh, no, that's a fair assessment, but I'm just saying if you're scattering these things around, and I think a household could easily live on a 1/4 kilowatt per hour, 6 hours in the day. So they could generally create 1.5 kilowatts of energy a day. It's fine. I understand your point. You're trying to create economies of scale and things like that. But I was just looking at
the $400 number. Yeah. And there are definitely businesses out there that are using that model. They're selling solar lanterns that have cell phone charging. So they're selling kind of, not microgrid, but even nanogrid, household level electrification units.
Because what made this possible now is with microinverters and the whole contained units, the whole technology shift that's happening, and you'll see that in the developing world, because otherwise it was really expensive, but now you can create these very low-cost systems.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think it's an open question how the economics play out. So I tend to think that the economies of scale are pretty real, and given that you've got the national grid within, literally going over some people's land, to me that seems like an opportunity to take advantage of, to connect people to the national grid.
Okay, I'd like to know about how's the electricity market organized in Kenya? Is it a single public utility, or there is competition between?
There's a little bit of competition at the
generation. Makes a difference in the prices and the efficiency of the utility and the cost for the installation of the systems of connections of the.
Wait, sorry, what was the second part of the?
Because I'm from Colombia. We had a similar situation about 20 years ago, when it was a single utility vertical integrated.
Yeah.
When they went to competition, different utility retailers, the connection price was down by tens of hundreds.
Okay,
so
okay.
I'd like to know how the situation there.
Yeah, just quickly, there's competition at the generation level, a little bit of competition, but not at the distribution level. Yeah, it's basically all Kenya Power Company. That's interesting. Yeah, that's a good point. That's interesting.
Yeah, could you comment on how, either if any work that you've done or that you're aware of, is able to predict how demand grows over time for electricity once people get a connection?
Yeah, so that's large part of why I'm interested in this. I think that, as I showed with the maps, the real growth in energy demand is likely to come from these areas of the world where not many people are connected yet, or if they're connected, they're just doing lighting. But so I've done a little bit of work that suggests that there's a real kind of inflection point, a real increase in the rate of growth of energy demand when people come out of poverty and enter the middle class. Basically, as people buy refrigerators, buy cars, start eating processed food, there's just a real increase, nonlinear increase in energy demand as people enter the middle class.
Yeah, I guess the context of my question is kind of in terms of like planning microgrids or small scale projects. Like, as someone going into that field, how would you recommend thinking about planning for future growth based on what you're currently observing in electricity demand?
Get back to me in 2 years or 18 months or something, and I'll give you some concrete numbers. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. This was a fantastic talk, and I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for the comments.